Hello, and welcome back to the Fireside Lit Book Club, a quiet, candlelit corner of the internet where we read slowly, think deeply, and speak authentically about our experiences. I'm Lindsay, and I invite you to join me by the fire as we explore the soul of a book, the beauty it reveals, the questions it asks, and the ways it helps us understand life, identity, and meaning just a little more clearly. As 2025 comes to a close, I found myself wanting to devote an episode where I just reflect on all the books I've read throughout the year. My grand total across these last 12 months is 42 books, and I'm actually in the process of currently reading a few others. At the moment, I'm reading The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, loving it so far. I just don't feel right including it in this list and the others that I'm probably due to finish before January begins, simply because I like to finish a book and gather all of my thoughts and ideas before summarizing it or recommending it or not recommending it. So I'm going to stick to these 42 books that I've read in totality, or as we'll see, that I read enough of but ultimately decided to DNF. In Goodreads lingo, that means did not finish. So those are the books we'll be focusing on today. And I would say that these 42 books are a decent mix of fiction, classic literature, psychology, and spirituality, as well as the odd poetry book here and there. So you'll see that my taste in books is pretty eclectic. I do like to... I consider myself a well-rounded reader because I like to venture out into different genres and categories just to keep my reading horizons broad and just to, challenge myself with new material and learn something. So what surprises me the most looking back on this year's reading experiences is how much of a mixed bag they were. I think if I had a guess, as I just alluded to, this would be the first year that I really had a lot of DNFs. With 12 books I found I absolutely could not continue with, and also on the other hand, a very successful year in terms of most satisfying reads. I'm pretty meticulous about the ratings I give my books, and that goes for whether or not I continue with a book, and if I finish that book, whether I'm going to give it 1 star or like 4 or 5 stars. I do give books here and there like 2 or 3 stars, but it's more often that I can't stand a book or find myself really, really loving it. And for me, those are actually the most rewarding experiences, the 1 and 4 and 5 stars alike, because I find I really enjoy when I have strong feelings about what I'm reading. I think that if a book is written well, that kind of should be the end goal. Like, you're either going to alienate people or you're going to attract a larger base of readers. Except if a book is just really, really poorly written, then of course, you're putting off people for all the wrong reasons. So anyway, I gave 4 books 5-star ratings, and I gave 6 of the books I read 4 stars. And, I continue to feel that that's one of the best ways you can honor an author, is just to take their work seriously enough to thoroughly consider it. So for me, 10 books receiving 4 and 5 stars in a year is actually a pretty big deal. I originally compiled this year's list both by feel and by reading books I found were natural segues to other books. So, for example, I chose to read Life of Pi and Beloved because they were included in the book The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams, and I chose to pick up Mysticism by Simon Critchley because it felt like a natural continuation of Richard Rohr's Falling Upward, which was which was one of my 5-star reads for the year. In general, I like when my books have a common thread or fit together thematically well, so I can let some of the ideas and topics I've stumbled upon kind of marinate and take root in my mind. Overall, I would say this year's reading list has been an absolute blessing and a godsend to me because I honestly feel that this year has been the most miserable of my life, you guys. Forgive me if that's a bit more honesty than what you'd expect to hear on a podcast, but oh man, was 2025 a doozy. My beautiful little girl turned 1 in the last few weeks, and I am still dealing with postpartum struggles that have been ongoing since the 2nd week out from childbirth. So needless to say, it's been a hell of a long year, and books and reading kept my mind occupied and provided just, a flicker of excitement on days where I was not physically capable of doing much else other than reading. So in honor of those books that made this past year just a little more tolerable, I'm going to be sharing my 2025 reading list with you all tonight and my reflections on each work. So let's get into it. Here is every book I read in 2025, along with the thoughts, impressions, and honest reactions each one left me with. Unfortunately, I kicked off the year with a DNF. This Time Next Year by Sophie Cousins was a contemporary fiction book whose premise seemed like something I would adore, with two babies born on the first day of the new year who eventually run into each other in life and fall in love. But I found the story to be pretty uninteresting and unpredictable. The romance just wasn't convincing, and the plot was not captivating enough to carry me through this novel's 350 pages. So I retired this one after about a third of the way through, which I tend to do when I'm just really, really not loving a book, and I moved on to Brené Brown's The Gifts of Imperfection. This one, however, was also a DNF. I should emphasize that I actually love self-help and psychology books. You will see that as we continue moving through this list. But Brené Brown was actually just uninspiring, and she actually just pissed me off after the first few chapters. This is a woman whose name is spoken with the same reverence as Oprah or Gandhi, yet she is vastly overrated. The Gifts of Imperfection was replete with cliched and hackneyed platitudes, and I found myself wondering just 20 pages in how it was possible this woman was as big of a name as she is. Brown drones on and on about her research, which in the book she specifies she's a shame researcher, whatever that means, and rattles off advice about improving self-esteem that has already been posed in every other similar book on the market. I far preferred The Joy of Missing Out by Tanya Dalton and Girl Wash Your Face by Rachel Hollis to this sad, uninspired little book. So I promptly moved on from here to the book Predisposed, Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences by John R. Hibbing. And I picked this one up at the Princeton University bookstore called Labyrinth Books, which always has some really unique and interesting titles I rarely find elsewhere. It's actually more of a psychology book than a political book, and zeroes in on what makes liberals liberal and what makes conservatives conservative. I remained fairly engaged for the majority of the book before finally retiring it somewhere around the 60% mark because it was rather verbose, in my opinion, for the subject matter. I believe it could have been more successful for me if it had been about half the length of what it was, though there was a lot of research and many social experiments presented in this book that probably warrant its 300 pages. Afterward, I moved on to The Reading List, which I mentioned in my intro, by Sarah Anisha Adams, and I found this one just kind of lackluster at best. By now, you guys are probably listening and wondering, well, geez, what does this girl enjoy? But I promise we will get to those books further down the line. For me, The Reading List fell flat despite its bookish emphasis because I found the writing to be dull, the characters to fall flat, and their relationships to not be very convincing. I also struggled with the many loose ends of the story that were simply never addressed. Ultimately, I spent about half this novel waiting for it to pick up and the last 100 pages wishing it would end. Thankfully, from here, I had a redemptive experience with O Pioneers by Willa Cather. And this was a book I was excited about from the get-go. From the first few pages, from the writing and the characters alone, I knew this was a story I would finally be immersed in after my first few unsuccessful reads of the year. As a little background, I connected with this novel in a special way because my grandparents actually owned a 4,000-acre farm in Nebraska where my father was raised, and every time I picked up O Pioneers, I was reminded of my family and my heritage. Even more than that, Cather depicts prairie country in a way that simply makes you fall in love with it, with sentences that resonate deeply and read like poetry. The book was a bit slow at times, but picked up to the point that I could not put it down by the last 30 pages. I was shocked by the ending, which is always a fun element of any novel. And the events that unfolded in this book were ultimately events I felt at heart level, and I am very eager to read more of Cather's work in the future. Afterward, I moved happily along to The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which I could not put down from the very first chapter. The idea of a main character exploring parallel universes made for a really compelling reading experience, and I found I was very invested in her fate and what would ultimately become of her. This novel was a playground for imaginative readers, and even though fantastic elements in a story are usually not my jam, they simply worked really, really well here. I moved on to Redeeming Heartache by Dan Allender after this, and I'd actually first heard of Dan Allender on a really great podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves, which explores healing from past trauma through a spiritual lens. It's a podcast I've loved for years, and I was excited to dive into Redeeming Heartache since it was so highly regarded by Adam Young, the psychologist who hosts The Place We Find Ourselves. While I did find this book had value and I enjoyed the deep dive into how the human brain processes trauma, I did find the heavy reliance on archetypes to be overkill. I also don't really love when individual stories are explored frequently in psychology books, and I've noticed this anecdotal style is a trend with many, from David Schnark to Albert Ellis to Brennan Mullaney. I don't read psychology for the narratives, I read it for the aha explanations into the human psyche, so all the way around, I struggled a bit to get into this one. It also had a hyper-spiritual focus on healing and trauma, which simply wasn't for me. I segued from psychology to short story with The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which I'd heard great things about, but nevertheless fell flat for me. It's not particularly chilling, and there really isn't much suspense, which I'd gotten the impression there would be, having heard a bit about this famous story in advance. Its most remarkable attribute is that it successfully relays gaslighting before gaslighting was even really a concept. As an aside, I did enjoy several of Gilman's poems. Those were also included in my Penguin edition of Gilman's work. For those of you who don't know this, I really, really love the Penguin Classics version of novels and poetry. I think that Penguin Classics does a great job of compiling an author's relevant, most prominent works, so you get a good feel of their comprehensive writing style, not just like one or two stories or one novel. I also attempted to read Herland, which was included in this book, but was too bored by the third chapter to continue. Not to mention, every last piece of Gilman's is far too on the nose when it comes to feminist themes. It seems almost like Gilman relied on her feminist ideology to make her work shocking, which may have worked at the time, but these days is nothing groundbreaking. From here, I very sadly report that I went on with high expectations to The Skin of Our Teeth by Thornton Wilder, whose work I absolutely fell in love with a year or two ago upon reading Our Town. This play, however, was much, much more experimental, which usually doesn't work so well for me, but really didn't work in this case. With this in mind, I guess it would make sense that I would hate Skin of Our Teeth, as Wilder drew inspiration for this play from the work of James Joyce, an author whose work increasingly makes me feel like the little boy in The Emperor's New Clothes. This is a play that is nearly impossible to follow. It is that nonsensical. The first, second, and third acts have absolutely nothing to do with each other, and the characters don't have straightforward personalities, relationships, or storylines. The fourth wall was broken so many times I lost count, which made for a jarring and unpleasant reading experience. I will probably give Wilder one more chance in the future, maybe with The Bridges of San Luis Rey, since I did love Our Town so much. And unfortunately, it goes from bad to worse with The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway. My experiences thus far with Hemingway can be summed up quite simply. Can't stand him. I never cared for the run-on style sentences, the plots that continuously fail to captivate me, and the overall blatant masculine quality of his prose. However, upon visiting his home in Key West, I picked up this slender novel thinking it seemed interesting. I'm a sucker for biblical allegory, and the story of a young, recently married couple trepsing all around Europe seemed promising. And in fact, The Garden of Eden is quite readable for the first few chapters, and then it just got weird. I was glad to put down this twisted little book about halfway through when I decided I just couldn't continue with it. I then moved on to a refreshing palate cleanser, Bittersweet by Susan Cain. A lot of you may recognize Susan Cain's name from her more famous book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, but this was actually my first Susan Cain read, and I really, really loved this book. Bittersweet makes you reflect deeply on your personality, your outlook, and the way you live your life. Do we spend the majority of our time avoiding our own pain and heartache? Do we feel able to share it with others? What does it mean to experience sorrow and longing, and how do we harness the melancholic to move forward and heal? These are all questions that Cain's book tackles. It is packed with insights about human suffering, beauty, and transcendence, making it a worthwhile read for anyone who appreciates the meaning and depth in imperfection. The next book I read was The Course of Love by Alain de Botton, which I ended up ultimately enjoying, though it wasn't anything spectacular. This was a refreshingly honest, realistic account of what love looks like through the years, how it changes shape, strives, struggles, and grows. The novel reads like a memoir told from the main character Rabi's point of view, though I imagined the whole time that Botton was really writing his own love story. It made me reflect on my own marriage and was replete with truth bombs that compelled me to go back and read them several times over. Where I think the book fell a bit flat for me was its meandering italicized sections, seemingly strewn throughout the novel for the effect of, oh, look what a crafty writer I am. I found these sections to be needlessly wordy, even a bit clunky at times. They didn't read easily at all. Half the time I had no idea what Baton was trying to say through his mess of adjectives and a rather boastful display of big vocab words. That said, I do think The Course of Love is head and shoulders better and more literary than most contemporary romance novels, in addition to being 1,000 times more real. I moved on from the novel form to short story with How Much Land Does a Man Need by Leo Tolstoy, and I was really glad I made time for this succinct but meaningful little work. Tolstoy is probably one of my favorite authors, though I haven't yet read his sprawling masterpiece, War and Peace. That said, I have read Anna Karenina, which is one of my favorite books to date, as well as his short story collection included in the Penguin edition entitled The Cossacks, and his commentary or long-form essay on art entitled What is Art? I have valued and been moved and challenged by each of his works I've read, and How Much Land Does a Man Need was no exception. I highly recommend this quick, yet thought-provoking read on greed and excess with the underlying message of learning to be content with what one has. Afterward, I picked up The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon, whom I'd read one other time with her book I Was Anastasia, which I was so excited to pick up back then due to the fact that I am neurodivergent and one of my special interests in life has been the Romanov dynasty. But that work fell flat for me in many areas, and I found The Frozen River kind of followed suit. Lawhon seems to specialize in historical fiction, but for some reason her plots and characters just don't deliver as effectively as they could. The premise of The Frozen River was quite a good one, but I found it to be simply too lengthy for the subject matter and the plot. This book definitely lagged at many points and only really picked up and became something truly interesting in the last 50 pages or so. This will probably be the last of Lawhon's work that I invest my time in. Fortunately, we move from here to one of my favorite reads of the year, and that is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. If you've been following along with the podcast, you know I devoted a whole episode to this fantastic, unique, heart-wrenching novel. It is probably one of the best fiction reads by a contemporary author I've ever had the pleasure to experience, and I highly recommend you give this one a try. It may not appeal to everyone because the writing is fairly experimental, and I know this is a deterrent for me 9 times out of 10, but for some reason in Lincoln in the Bardo, it proved highly successful. For a deep dive into this book, head over to my episode entitled On Life, Death, and What Comes After. And now we regress and take a step backward with Before We Were Strangers by Renee Carlino. This author specializes in the new adult genre, which is a more up-and-coming genre that sits somewhere between YA and contemporary fiction, focusing on college-aged main characters and which I myself contribute to with my own writing. Up to this point, it has been my preferred genre as an author. So when I first stumbled across Renee Carlino several years ago, I was really eager to check out her books, as their summaries seemed genuinely interesting and they'd received high praise on Goodreads as well. My first ever Carlino read was Swear on This Life, which was actually quite good and really enjoyable, but Before We Were Strangers is the kind of book that makes me despair at the entire publishing industry. The fact that this author is as acclaimed as she is, with a book replete with typos, grammatical errors, and cliches, just makes me mad. It's a waste of time, money, and paper across the board. I retired this one at a third of the way through, deciding I couldn't even stomach it as a fluff read at bedtime. I changed direction after that and pivoted to a spiritual read with When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, not quite sure how to pronounce that. This book has a focus on Zen Buddhism, but in general contains solid advice about coping with pain, ego, and loss. It was decent at the time, but ultimately proved pretty forgettable. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one, but I don't have anything against it either. Afterward, I moved on to Rainer Maria Rilke's poetry with Change Your Life, and it was okay, but not anything I fell in love with. I would say this is more due to the fact that it's pretty hard for me to get into poetry, but I keep attempting it, hoping someday it'll just click. I have yet to come to that day. This was my third foray in Rilke's work, following Letters to a Young Poet and the selected poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke. I do find his language to be quite beautiful, particularly his famous quote about "live the questions now." If you know, you know, is all I'll say. But I've just always struggled a bit with poetry in general, so maybe this was a me issue more than a Rilke issue. That said, I am a huge fan of Pablo Neruda, so maybe it also has to do with style of the poetry. I don't really know. Speaking of things that didn't really click for me, Beloved by Toni Morrison was one of my DNFs this year, and I was sad to get to the point where I felt I had to put it down. But after reading about 60% of this book and finding it was a drudgery to pick up each time, I finally decided to place it back on the shelf. I will say, hoping this lands the right way, that I don't love the American South genre. There's not much I like about the South in general, including its writers, Faulkner to Flannery O'Connor to most of Mark Twain. With that admission out of the way, I can now move on to Morrison's writing. Beloved was my introduction to her work, for which I had high hopes, but from page 1, I was disappointed. The story had the potential, I think, to be riveting, but the way Morrison presented it was just weird. The writing was purposely ambiguous and experimental, leaving me looking up my many questions on Google to fill in the blanks where my reading experience couldn't. I don't do well with experimental literature, as you now well know. There are exceptions to this rule, however, but I very much tend to prefer realism and straightforward language, though I often find poetic prose quite lovely and am a fan of that writing style. But Beloved was not as poetic as it was confusing. I had to look up several elements of the plot simply because they were not described or presented in a straightforward manner. It was almost as though Morrison was describing incoherent scenes from a dream, which was probably the point but proved ineffective for me. Many of her descriptions are implications rather than direct narrations, and this will never be a style that works for me. I haven't decided whether I will attempt more of Toni Morrison in the future, but I can say that for now her writing style is not compatible with my taste. Moving on to books I vastly enjoyed, so we get quite a swing from 1 to 5 stars here, is Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, a Catholic priest whose work I've admired for the better part of 2 years. I wish with all of my heart that this man was still speaking publicly. I would fly into any city in the world to hear him speak and possibly meet him, as he is one of my top 5 people, dead or alive, I would most love to have dinner with, but sadly his career came to a close with his diagnosis of lymphoma. What I love so much about Rohr is his insight and nuanced take on the Catholic faith. He presents the same spiritual truths I've heard throughout my life, but in a totally new light, where certain biblical passages and doctrines are actually open to interpretation rather than a cut and dry, this is the way it is approach. His take is refreshing and important, and I plan to read many more of his books in the future. We segue from spirituality back to poetry with Howl by Allen Ginsberg. And I was admittedly underwhelmed by this collection of poetry, which I had heard mentioned for years by booktubers and in my favorite show, Gilmore Girls. Ginsberg strikes me as a bit of a madman, but perhaps that's part of his appeal. His poetry doesn't seem lucid, though I read that's because you're supposed to experience each poem like a fever dream. Of all the works in this short collection, the eponymous Howl probably absorbed my attention the most. I read it twice, simply because I realized there was so much raw emotion there that I had missed the first time around. Ginsberg is explicit, grotesque, and almost dares you to look away at times as you read his work, but I can see that's where some of his appeal lies. Nevertheless, this volume of poetry was not for me, and I found myself glad of its brevity. I decided to pick up a contemporary work after this, and overall enjoyed my reading of The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. If you know, you know, you guys. I do not know how to pronounce this author's last name. Anyway, I love a good psychological thriller, but I admittedly found this book to be lackluster and even slow-moving for its reputation. Though the premise was interesting and the writing was decent, I didn't truly get into the book until the last 60 pages or so. That said, I'm learning this is the way most thrillers seem to go, though I can't say I'm a fan of merely biding my time for the first 3/4 of any book. Another small critique here is that this book read a bit like a detective novel, despite the fact that the main character and the narrator was a psychotherapist, not a PI. I don't really care for the whodunit genre, so it was something that stuck out to me. I can think, similarly of, why am I blanking on her name? Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. I actually really like other books by her that are a bit less famous, but for the whodunit theme alone, I really didn't connect with Murder on the Orient Express. That was kind of the vibe this book gave me. I will say I enjoyed the ending of The Silent Patient. It was a bit confusing initially, but it was ultimately satisfying and shocking. So I enjoyed the last few chapters immensely. This next book, and I say book in air quotes, really doesn't even deserve to be mentioned. I was so mad. I wasted an evening on it. Brave Enough by Cheryl Strayed was essentially just one long-winded pep talk with her own cliched quotes and sayings that she must have considered secretly genius, spanning 160 pages. I was expecting great things from follow-up works by Strayed after my reading of her memoir, Wild, but this book fell flat in every way and doesn't deserve the paper it's printed on. Seems like we're following a pattern of good, bad here, so we'll continue the trend with good. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf was originally created as a lecture series for students at the University of Cambridge and is enlightening, empowering, even quite humorous at times. Woolf sheds light on hard truths for both the student body of the time and the modern reader, emphasizing the fact that time, privacy, money, and resources are needed for a woman to reach her full potential as a writer. The most prolific female writers in history, from Jane Austen to the Bronte sisters to George Eliot, became so in spite of the disadvantages of their sex, which largely confined them to the common sitting or drawing room, where they would inevitably face constant interruptions and from which they never truly ventured far. Woolf argues that a woman's place in the home, barred from the experience of real life, limits the genius of her work and even results in the tainting of the work she does produce, since many women turn to writing as a catharsis to air their feelings about the frustration of society's limitations on their sex. It is my opinion that everyone should read this book, and more specifically, every woman should read this book as a reminder of what is possible and what she deserves. Alongside A Room of One's Own, I also read Orlando, another of Virginia Woolf's works, which proved to be extremely complementary to the point that I decided to pair them together in an earlier podcast episode. Of all the Woolf works that I've read, I would have to say Orlando takes the cake for being the most absorbing, entertaining, and even funny. Woolf was a satirist, which made this unorthodox book that much more of an enjoyable read. I found the questions that Woolf posed about gender identity in this book to be thought-provoking and extremely relevant to today's time. I found myself asking what it really means to be male or female and whether I would, on the whole, be the same person if I were male. I would hands down recommend this novel over Mrs. Dalloway, but perhaps tied with To the Lighthouse for its unique and complex themes and story. I then moved on to a book called Emerson, the Stoics, and Me by Mark Matusik. And unfortunately, my excitement to dive into anything pertaining to Emerson and transcendentalist spirituality promptly dwindled with each page of this book, which became rather repetitive. This was a DNF for me at about 50%. Continuing with my pattern of oscillating impressions, I absolutely adored Life of Pi by Jan Martel, so much so that I decided to devote an entire podcast episode to it. It is riveting, page-turning, and it's a story about survival, meaning, hope, and faith. And when I say faith, I mean faith in a very mystical sense, rather than a list of rules or doctrines. Martel's skillful application of allegory makes for an exceptionally powerful read that will linger in your mind for hours after putting down the novel. When you're not reading Life of Pi, you'll be thinking about it. I highly, highly recommend this book if you've not encountered it yet. It is well worth the read. I picked up another novel after this, and unfortunately, The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams took far too long to read, simply because I never had any incentive to pick it up. It was okay enough, and even appropriate, to reserve for nighttime reading before bed, as it certainly brought on drowsiness. However, nothing about this book is particularly memorable or remarkable. With a story revolving around words and language, I thought it was a novel I would love, but nothing truly advances the plot, and the characters experience very little growth or development. I was pleased to move from this book into Happy Place by Emily Henry, which I picked up as a light summer romance and actually was well written and developed, something that is often not the case with the romance genre, whose stories all seem to borrow from each other and are super overdone. This was my first Henry read, and she's a masterful storyteller with a strong command of her craft. I enjoyed the main coastal setting, the relationships between characters, and the sparks that flew between the two main characters. What didn't work for me was the sheer length of the novel, 385 pages, which could have easily been trimmed by 100 pages, especially when you stop to think about, as an author, I'm very cognizant of word counts for specific genres. If memory serves, I'm pretty sure 50,000 words or so is the sweet spot for romance, so I'm not quite sure how she gets away with publishing such long romance novels. Good for her, I guess. It just, it ultimately didn't work for me. I did enjoy this book overall, though, and thought it was great for the summer season. As I read Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, I wanted to like it so much that I even stayed with it a little longer than I normally would, given my lack of enjoyment or engagement. Gilead is not just slow-moving, it's unremarkable and dry as the Midwestern plains where the story unfolds. I should emphasize that I'm not deterred by character-driven novels. I don't typically need some fast-paced psychological thriller to feel that a story is captivating. That said, the majority of Gilead is spent describing family relations between old men we've never been introduced to and are honestly rather crotchety and altogether uninteresting. I thought this epistolary novel would have more of a focus on faith and philosophical revelations, which I'd really been looking forward to. I could have done without the extensive background on the main character's family tree, though. I retired this at around 40% due to a lack of interest in the characters and lack of a coherent theme. Next, I read Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano, which I loved so much that I actually did a deep dive episode about this book. These types of reading experiences always remind me of the reason I fell in love with books and reading in the first place. They immerse you in other worlds the way a movie or any other type of content simply can't rival. Napolitano is a skilled, gifted writer who expertly weaves a story of a close-knit, loving, hopelessly flawed family. Each character's portrait is painted in a way that leaves you feeling as though you truly know them and understand what makes them tick. You will find yourself loving and hating these characters in equal measure, which means the author has done her job well. Each comes with lovable and loathsome qualities, just as your own family and friends do. I picked up a book entitled Mysticism by Simon Critchley after this, but found it simply to be too long and tedious for the subject matter. I started off interested, but Critchley seems to talk in circles and spends a lot of time speaking rather nebulously about mysticism. For this reason, I retired this one at around 30%, as I typically do with DNFs. Next, I moved on to Only Child by Rhiannon Naveen, which started out with a bang, literally, and then began to lag a bit. Certain subplots and storylines were introduced to keep things moving, but I felt they could have been better emphasized with their loose ends tied up for a consistently interesting read. I did enjoy this one. It did make me emotional at times. The fact that it was written from a first grader's perspective made sense, but it just didn't fully work for me. After this, I picked up my first essay collection of the year, and I am incredibly glad that I did. I bought These Precious Days on a lark one day, having not read much of Ann Patchett at all, only the famous Bel Canto for a high school English class, which I remember liking well enough despite the fact that it didn't leave a lasting impression. This book was probably my biggest reading surprise of 2025. Patchett's essays are replete with emotional resonance, exploring the universal themes of loss, friendship, family, and letting go. Every essay reveals some essential truth of what it means to be fully, deeply human in a way that does not feel trite or overdone. This book made me cry multiple times, especially in the last few essays. All the best books seem to appeal to the emotions in this way, in my opinion, so I can't rave about These Precious Days enough. I will definitely be exploring more of Patchett's work in the near future, and am excited to encounter her voice again in her novels. I had another phenomenal experience right after this with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was my first Stevenson read, and as a Victorian writer, it is no surprise to me that I immediately fell in love with his work. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was, in some ways, exactly what I expected, and in other ways, a total surprise. Its complexity and shock value were strong, and as I was reading, I suspect I entered a flow state where at times I barely remembered to breathe. I was that captivated by this compelling story, invested not only in the outcome, but in the psychological themes and moral lessons of the novella. For more reflections on this book, check out my Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde episode, published a few months ago here on the podcast. In spite of my affinity for Victorian literature as a whole, there are a very few select Victorian authors I do not click with, and Henry James appears to be one of those, though after just this preliminary reading, I'm not so sure I can totally make that judgment yet. I probably have a lot of audacity to be making this statement about an author who was clearly brilliant and is renowned in the literary world for his timeless contributions, but after reading The Turn of the Screw, I came to the conclusion that this book and Henry James are extremely overhyped, or at least that's true for me. I finished it and was, scoffing / frowning / wanted to throw it against the wall. Apparently, James wrote this book in weekly installments, ending each chapter with a cliffhanger to keep his readers guessing. For me, the whole installments thing just doesn't seem to work well. I'm actually not sure which other authors use it aside from Henry James and Charles Dickens. My suspicion is that a lot of them probably did, if that was the way they were mostly, getting their royalty checks, getting paid. But just, to my knowledge, based on these two authors alone, I really can't say I love when work is very obviously it looks as though it's written in installments. I like when stories have a cohesive flow to them, and it just, I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit here, but Turn of the Screw did not have that for me. The other issue is that at times the story felt rather unbelievable, and perhaps my biggest gripe was even at the end of the book, we are left with more questions and a singular event that makes virtually no sense, which I won't give away in case you haven't read it yet and want to. I also had personal hangups with James's syntax, where whole paragraphs felt incomprehensible and were exceedingly convoluted. And I looked this up, and apparently he wrote this way to purposely confuse readers, leading them to question whether the narrator was reliable. But I hate this style and feel it is too experimental to result in a cohesive, tight story. It did not advance or improve the narrative at all, and I suspect it's a modernist technique, as James straddled the line between the Victorian era and modernism. I did give this book 2 out of 5 stars on Goodreads because there was some suspense, though I wish it had culminated in an ending that was actually satisfying. Next, I picked up The Sentence by Louise Erdrich, whom I'd heard really promising things about and whose writing style is obviously something special. That translates pretty obviously in the first few pages. That said, this book was a DNF for me, as the characters were not interesting enough, nor did there appear to be much of a plot. Perhaps it was particularly this Erdrich book that wasn't my cup of tea. I will likely explore more work of hers in the future. In homage to my deep love of nature, particularly during the fall season, I turned to Poems on Nature, which is a very slim little volume that includes poems by Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and John Keats, to name just a few. As with most poetry books, I stuck to one poem a day to really give that particular poem time to marinate and take root in my mind, but despite sitting with each poem, I still can't say I was a huge fan of this collection. Again, I blame this more on the fact that I don't connect easily with poetry more than, any other factor. I then read the book Then She Was Gone by Lisa Jewell, which was recommended and gifted to me by a friend. I knew nothing about this author or her work going in, but all I can say is I was blown away by how skilled of a storyteller Jewell is. Upon finishing this novel, I immediately went to Goodreads and added several more of her books to my to-be-read list. For those who appreciate unpredictable suspense and masterful writing, I highly recommend this author. Afterward, I moved to David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which has been on my short list for the last few years, but which I've consistently put off time and time again. Not sure if this was some type of clairvoyance on my end, but sure enough, this was not the book for me. This was my third Dickens novel and the only one I actually decided to retire before completing. I have never understood why I don't connect with Dickens, as he is essentially the father of Victorian writing, which I love more than any other era, as I have just stated a few sections back. But upon doing a bit of research, I learned that his work is more outward facing than many of the other Victorian authors I love, such as Oscar Wilde, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. These authors all typically have a psychological, moral, interior focus, and their work tends to be deep, intense, philosophical, and character-driven. Alternatively, authors like Dickens and Trollope, who I actually have not read yet, have a focus on social satire, and they tend to specialize in caricature and develop outward-facing narratives. I do plan to read Hard Times in the future, as this is apparently one Dickens novel that is tightly plotted with less padding and a less chaotic supporting cast. A Christmas Carol and Oliver Twist also remain on my list for their presence in pop culture. After loving the book Sweet Bitter, I thought I would have an equally great experience with Stray, Stephanie Danler's memoir. While her writing consistently shines for me, I absolutely, love her as an author, it was simply too much into her dysfunctional and rather boring life. I really didn't need 300 pages worth of Danler's complicated relationship with her parents and her messy, frankly immoral romantic relationships based on infidelity and commitment issues. I stayed for the writing, but was over this book pretty quickly. Finally, I ended the year with a bang with Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This book not only commanded my full attention, but educated me on the historical events of the Magdalen Laundry, which I had no idea existed. Small Things Like These is the perfect holiday read, as the Christmas season should compel us all to act with kindness, charity, and integrity, just as the main character, Bill Furlong, does. His quiet act of heroism is the foundation for this book, and the reason why it is so great. Keegan couldn't have written a better main character. Lost a star for some slower pacing in the first several pages, which does ultimately build to a satisfying climax and conclusion. For a deep dive into this book, check out my podcast episode on complicity and conscience in Small Things Like These. As I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, there are a few books I'm currently reading, as I had some space in my schedule to close out the year. One of those is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. And I also plan to turn to the Fifth Avenue Story Society by Rachel Hauck, as well as A Christmas Carol by my favorite, Charles Dickens. I figured I might as well give him another try with a festive end-of-year read, and more importantly, a slim, digestible one at that. What have your years in reading looked like? Which books particularly stood out to you or taught you something new this year? Which did you DNF or really just not click with? Drop your answers in the comment section, and as always, thank you for joining me around the fire to talk all things literary. Be well and happy holidays.